That massive oak door is covered in iron studs for a reason. We are about to unlock the hidden history behind one of the most common yet mysterious sites of the Middle Ages. This is a true historical detective story where we will piece together the secrets of medieval security, symbolism, and sheer survival. By the end, you will see these ancient doors not as simple antiques, but as complex masterpieces of engineering and psychological warfare. We will uncover why a simple entrance needed to become an ironclad barrier, and how the patterns hammered into the wood conveyed messages of power and faith. What does the design of a front door tell you about the dangers its owners feared? Think of a medieval door not as a single piece, but as a collection of massive oak planks. These were not the thin uniform boards we see today. They were cut from ancient towering trees, each plank a hand's breadth thick and incredibly heavy. This solid wood was the first line of defense, a formidable barrier in its own right. But wood, for all its strength, has three great enemies. The first is splitting. A solid strike from a heavy weapon like a warhammer could easily crack a plank along its grain. The second is warping. Over years of exposure to rain, sun, and snow, even the best timber can twist and bend, creating gaps that let in drafts and, worse, prying eyes. The third and most immediate threat was brute force. A determined attacker with a heavy axe could chop directly through the wood, splintering it until a hole was torn right through the center. The door's great weakness was its very nature. It was designed to be opened and closed, which meant it had to be weaker than the stone walls surrounding it. This inherent vulnerability is what turned the door from a simple entrance into a critical point of failure. Protecting this wooden shield was not an optional upgrade. It was a matter of survival. Into this world of constant threat, the door stood as the ultimate weak point. While stone walls could withstand arrows and weather for years, the entrance was designed to open. It was the one spot where the castle or manor's formidable armor was deliberately thin. This made it the primary target for any attacker, from a small band of raiders to an entire besieging army. A rival lord seeking to claim a neighbor's lands would not patiently chip away at the fortress walls. He would direct his men and their heavy tools straight at the gate. The door was the bottleneck, the critical juncture where a single failure could lead to total collapse. Behind that wooden barrier was everything worth protecting. It was not just the lives of the family and their servants, but the very means of their survival. The storerooms held the harvest, the salt meat, and the grain that would last through a long winter or a prolonged siege. The strong boxes contained coins, jewelry, and important documents. If that door gave way, everything was lost. The clang of an axe against wood was a sound of pure terror, signaling the end of safety and the beginning of slaughter or subjugation. This is why reinforcing the door was not about simple home improvement. It was an act of desperation, a direct response to the chilling reality that your front door was the only thing standing between your world and chaos. The solution to this terrifying vulnerability lies in a simple principle of physics. Think of the force from a battering ram not as a single point of impact, but as a wave of energy. When that immense power hits a bare wooden plank, the energy has nowhere to go. It concentrates on one small area, overwhelming the wood's natural structure and causing it to splinter and crack. It is like trying to break a long, thin stick. If you snap it over your knee, the force is focused right in the center and it breaks easily. But if you try to break that same stick by pressing it flat against a stone wall, you would struggle. The wall distributes your force across the entire length of the stick, making it far stronger. This is exactly the role the iron studs played. Each one was a small, unyielding plate of metal. When a crushing blow landed directly on a stud, the iron did not absorb the energy. Instead, it transmitted that force sideways, spreading it out across the broad surface of the door. A strike that would have shattered a single plank was now dissipated across many planks, held together by the rigid iron network. The door was transformed from a collection of individual wooden boards into a single, unified shield. The studs acted as anchors, binding the planks together so they could not be pried apart. They also created a surface that was incredibly difficult to chop through. An axe blade would either skid off the rounded head of a stud or bite into the iron itself, a jarring and ineffective attack for the man wielding it. This was not just decoration, it was a brilliant, practical application of force distribution, turning a fundamental weakness into a legendary strength. So the iron stud was born from this pressing need for strength. Forget the tiny nails you might picture holding together a modern piece of furniture. These were formidable pieces of wrought iron, each one a substantial object in its own right. Picture a heavy metal disc, often more than an inch across, with a thick shank descending from its center. A blacksmith would heat this iron and hammer it into shape, creating a round head that was smooth and domed. The installation was a two-person job. One person would hold a massive metal backing plate called a rove against the inside of the door. The other, standing outside, would drive the stud shank straight through the thick oak planks. Once the iron tip burst through the interior wood and touched the rove, it was immediately clenched over, hammered flat and tight against the metal plate. This process created a permanent iron clamp. The door was no longer just wood glued or pegged together. It was now a single monolithic unit, with the outer iron heads forming a protective skin and the internal clenching binding everything into an unbreakable grip. You could not pull these studs out. You could not force the planks apart. The door became a unified shield, its wooden core locked in place by a grid of unyielding iron. This iron stitching transformed the door into something far greater than the sum of its parts. Think of each vertical oak plank as a separate rib. Left on their own, these ribs could be forced apart, their seams pried open with a crowbar or split by a heavy impact. The iron studs acted like precise, unbreakable stitches, sewing these individual ribs together into a single, unyielding breastplate. They ran in horizontal rows across the door, binding the vertical planks together at critical intervals. This created a grid of immense strength. If an attacker managed to get the blade of an axe or a pry bar into the seam between two planks, the splitting force would travel along the wood's natural grain. But that split could only run so far before it slammed directly into a row of iron studs. The crack would be stopped dead. The energy of the blow, which sought to travel easily through the wood, had nowhere to go. It could not pass through the solid metal. To break the door, the attacker was no longer fighting wood. He was forced to fight the iron itself. Shattering a wrought iron stud with a hand tool was a nearly impossible task. The metal would simply ring with the impact, absorbing the blow and dissipating its force. Every stud was a tiny, immovable defender, a metal sentry that turned a potential catastrophic failure into a minor, contained incident. The door's greatest structural weakness, the seams between its planks, became its most heavily fortified points. Beyond just holding the door together, these iron studs presented a nightmare for any attacker with an axe. The rounded, protruding heads created a landscape of hard, unpredictable surfaces. To deliver a powerful blow, an axe wielder needs a flat, solid target. He puts his whole body into the swing, aiming to bury the blade deep into the wood and split it along the grain. But when that blade arcs toward a studded door, it rarely finds a clean purchase. Instead of biting into solid oak, the sharp edge is just as likely to skid across the curved, hardened iron. The force of the swing, meant to shatter the door, is deflected sideways in a shower of sparks. This glancing blow does almost no damage to the door, but it sends a jarring vibration up the attacker's arms, fatiguing him and threatening to numb his hands. Even worse for the assault, the axe blade itself could be badly damaged. Striking solid wrought iron could chip the edge, curl it over, or even crack the metal. A single misplaced swing could render a vital tool useless, turning a determined attack into a futile exercise in frustration. The door was no longer a passive barrier. It had become an active participant in the fight, defending itself by breaking the will and the weapons of those who sought to break it down. That grid of iron studs was never just a random scattering. As you look at surviving medieval doors, you start to notice a language written in metal. The earliest patterns are purely practical, simple rows of studs forming a grid. This was the most efficient way to stitch the planks together, creating that unified shield we discussed. But the human mind is not content with pure function for long. Soon these patterns began to evolve. Craftsmen and their patrons saw the broad, flat surface of the door as a canvas. The iron studs became their paint. A simple grid could be transformed. By placing studs closer together in certain lines, a blacksmith could create a diamond pattern. This was more than decoration. The diamond shape, with its intersecting lines, actually added a new layer of structural reinforcement, directing force in multiple directions at once. But the most telling patterns are the ones that move beyond physics and into the realm of belief. Look at a door from a church or a pious household, and you might see the studs arranged in the form of a cross. Every time the family passed through that door, they were reminded of their faith. More than that, they believed the symbol itself offered a layer of divine protection, a spiritual shield added to the physical one. For a noble family, the pattern could become a signature, a unique arrangement of studs, perhaps a specific rosette or a heraldic motif, announced who lived within. It was a statement of identity and status, hammered into iron for all to see. The door was no longer just a barrier. It was a statement, a proclamation of faith, power, and belonging, written in a language of cold, unyielding metal. But the story of these doors does not end with the studs you can see. For the ultimate secret to their strength, you have to step inside. Imagine turning the massive iron handle and walking through the doorway, then closing the door behind you. The outside face with its patterned studs is impressive, but the inside face often reveals the true masterpiece of engineering. There, bolted directly onto the oak planks, you would find a skeleton of iron. Massive wrought iron straps, each one as wide as your hand, were fixed across the back of the door in powerful diagonal patterns. The most common and effective of these was the simple X. One thick band ran from the top left corner to the bottom right, while its twin crossed over it from the top right to the bottom left. Sometimes a vertical bar connected the center of the X to the top and bottom of the door, forming a Z or a starburst pattern. These were not decorative additions. They were the door's internal reinforcement, its hidden armor. Think of the door as a shield. The studs on the front are the hard outer surface designed to deflect blows. But the iron straps on the back are the structural frame, the ribs that give the shield its shape and prevent it from collapsing. A battering ram does not just deliver a sharp, localized impact. It delivers a broad, crushing wave of force meant to push the entire door inward. Without internal bracing, even the thickest oak planks could bow under this relentless pressure. The wood might not splinter, but it could bend until its iron fittings snapped or the bar securing it gave way. The diagonal iron straps were the perfect defense against this. They work on a principle of tension. When a force tries to push the door inward, the straps are pulled tight. Iron is incredibly strong when stretched, and these bands would resist that pulling force with all their might. The X pattern was especially brilliant because it turned the door into a series of interlocking triangles, the most stable geometric shape known to engineering. The force from a ram strike was no longer fighting against a flat surface. It was being channeled along these rigid iron lines, distributed out to the strongest parts of the door frame, where the massive hinges and lock were mounted. This hidden iron skeleton meant that to break the door, you did not just have to break the wood. You had to overcome the tensile strength of a wrought iron web. It was a final invisible layer of security, ensuring that the last line of defense was quite literally unbreakable. All this iron and oak would be for nothing if the door could simply be lifted from its frame. The true anchors of this defensive system were the hinges, massive works of iron that did far more than just allow the door to swing. Picture a long black strap of wrought iron, sometimes stretching from the top of the door all the way to the bottom. This was not a small, discreet fitting. It was a bold, visible declaration of strength, hammered directly onto the face of the wood. These long strap hinges served a brilliant dual purpose. Their most obvious job was to carry the door's immense weight. A studded oak door could easily weigh several hundred pounds. A standard modern hinge would be torn from its screws in an instant under such a load. But the long strap hinge distributed that crushing weight along its entire length. The force was not concentrated on a few small points. It was spread across the full height of the door, transferring the burden evenly into the stone wall. This design turned the door's own mass from a liability into an asset, making it stable and incredibly difficult to dislodge. Yet their second function was just as vital for security. An attacker's classic trick was to try and pry the door upwards off its pins, but with a long strap hinge covering the seam between the door and the wall, there was no gap for a crowbar to fit into. The hinge itself became a protective plate, shielding the most vulnerable part of the entire mechanism, the point of rotation. That point of rotation relied on a deceptively simple component called the pintle. This was the stout iron pin, fixed vertically into the stone door frame upon which the hinge itself hung. The craftsmanship here was everything. A blacksmith would forge the hinge with a large, reinforced circular eye at its end. This eye would drop perfectly over the pintle pin, But the security did not come from a tight fit alone. The pintle was not merely sitting in a shallow hole. It was often set deep into the masonry, sometimes a foot or more, and then sealed with molten lead or iron to lock it permanently in place. To break this system, an attacker would not just have to break the iron pin. He would have to shatter the solid stone that encased it. The hinge was the unsung hero, a masterpiece of load-bearing engineering that transformed a heavy wooden barrier into a balanced, seamless, and immovable guardian of the threshold. Yet for all its iron stitching and hidden bracing, the door had one final secret. It was all held fast by the heart of the system, the lock. This was no small, delicate mechanism you could turn with a single key. It was a massive internal forge of iron, a mechanical puzzle housed in a heavy wooden or iron box mounted directly onto the door's interior face. The key itself was a formidable object, often as long as a man's hand, with a complex bit at its end, cut into a unique pattern of teeth and notches. When inserted into the keyhole, which was itself a small, defensible opening, this key would engage a series of internal levers or lift a set of tumblers. Only the correct pattern would align everything perfectly. When it did, the true power of the lock was unleashed. A thick iron bolt, sometimes as wide as 2 fingers, would slide horizontally from within the lock case, across the width of the door, and directly into a heavy iron staple mounted on the stone door frame. This was the ultimate connection. The door was not just closed, it was physically grafted to the wall, its wooden mass locked in place by a bar of solid iron. The studded face and the iron straps made the door an unbreakable shield, but it was this single sliding bolt that made it an immovable barrier. An attacker could not simply push the door open. He had to break that iron bolt, a task nearly impossible from the outside. The beautiful synergy of this design becomes clear when you consider the assault. The studs and straps protected the wood from axes and rams, but they also served a second, vital purpose. They created a protective shell around the lock itself. By making the door's surface a nightmare to attack, the defenders ensured that an intruder could never get a clean, direct strike at the lock case or the bolt mechanism. To even attempt to pick the lock, an attacker would need time and silence, 2 things in very short supply during an assault on a fortified door. Every element worked in concert. The studs broke the weapons and the will of those who tried to smash their way in, while the lock secured the prize, waiting patiently on the other side for the one person who held the right to enter. That door was more than a shield, it was a public ledger of wealth, written in a language everyone understood. In an age before mass production, iron was not just a metal. It was a valuable commodity, expensive and incredibly labor-intensive to produce. Think of the journey a single iron stud took before it was hammered into an oak plank. It began as raw ore, dug from the ground by miners. That ore then had to be smelted in a charcoal-fired furnace, a process that consumed vast quantities of precious fuel. A blacksmith would then heat and reheat the resulting bloom of iron, hammering it for hours to pound out the impurities and shape it into a usable bar. Only then could he begin to forge the studs themselves. Every single disc represented a significant investment of time, skill, and resources. So when a lord or a wealthy merchant commissioned a new door, the question was not just about security. It was about presentation. The amount of iron on the door's face was a direct reflection of the owner's purse. A simple grid of studs provided ample strength, but a door covered in dense, ornate patterns. That was a statement. It screamed that the owner could afford not only the functional minimum, but an extravagant surplus of this costly material. This was conspicuous consumption in its most solid form. A visitor, whether a friendly trader or a potential rival, would approach that entrance and immediately understand the power of the household. The door communicated a simple, unshakable truth. We are so secure in our resources that we can hammer vast wealth directly into our front wall, for all to see and none to challenge. It was a billboard of prosperity, proving that the family inside was not just protected, but profoundly established. Every single iron stud was a small victory over chaos. The man who forged them was more than a craftsman. He was a community's chief armorer. His workshop was the heart of local defense, a place where fire and muscle transformed raw earth into unbreakable guardians. His process began with iron ore, a heavy, unpromising rock dug from nearby bogs or shallow mines. This ore was then loaded into a charcoal-fired furnace, a blazing inferno that burned for days. The intense heat would separate the metal from the rocky waste, leaving behind a spongy, glowing mass known as a bloom. This raw iron was not the pure, homogeneous metal we know today. It was full of impurities called slag, brittle pockets that could shatter under stress. The blacksmith's true skill began here. He would heat this bloom in his forge until it glowed a brilliant orange. Then with a heavy sledgehammer, he would pound it rhythmically on his anvil. Each strike was precise, folding the metal over and over, driving out the slag and welding the pure iron fibers together. He was not just shaping metal, he was weaving it, creating a dense, fibrous material known as wrought iron. The name itself means worked iron, and it was this relentless hammering that gave it a unique strength and flexibility, a toughness that modern steel often lacks. To create a door stud, he would take a bar of this refined wrought iron and heat it once more. With deft blows from a smaller hammer, he would upset one end, thickening it into the disc-like head. The other end was drawn out into the long, sturdy shank. This was not mass production. Each stud was an individual, bearing the subtle marks of the hammer that formed it. The same painstaking process created the long strap hinges and internal braces. Forging a hinge that was both perfectly straight and incredibly strong required an intimate understanding of how metal moves under heat and pressure. A single flaw, a hidden crack, or a weak weld could mean the difference between a door that held and a door that failed. The blacksmith's reputation and the safety of everyone who relied on his work rested on this flawless execution. He was the unseen guardian, his skill literally hammered into the first and last line of defense. The language of the iron-studded door was not spoken only in castles. It echoed through the entire medieval world, from the holiest sanctuaries to the busiest market towns. A church's door, often the largest and most ornate in a village, was a beacon of community and a storehouse of sacred treasures. Its studs formed crosses and other religious symbols, serving a dual purpose. They physically protected the building from bandits who might target the silver chalices and relics inside, while also symbolizing the spiritual fortification of the faith itself. Monasteries, often isolated and self-sufficient, relied on their heavily studded gates to protect not just their monks but their vast stores of food, wine, and priceless illuminated manuscripts. These were not places of retreat from the world's dangers, but fortified communities that required the same practical security as any lord's hall. Then there were the town gates, the ultimate civic doors. These massive structures, closed each night at curfew, were the collective security for every person living within the walls. The studs and iron straps on these gates were a communal investment, a shared shield against armies, roaming bandits, and the chaos of the outside world. Their strength meant the difference between a safe night's sleep and potential disaster for hundreds of families. Even the homes of wealthy merchants adopted this design. A trader's house might not have had the towering walls of a castle, but his door proclaimed that within lay silks, spices, and chests of coin. His security was his prosperity, and the studded door was the most direct way to announce that his wealth was well protected. This tells us something profound about the medieval mindset. The need for security was not a luxury for the warrior class alone. It was a universal, daily concern that shaped the architecture of every important building. The studded door was a common answer to a common fear, a unifying thread of defense woven through the fabric of an entire society. Yet the true power of this door was not merely in its physical strength. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a silent shout of defiance aimed directly at the mind of any would-be intruder. Before a single blow was ever struck, that wall of iron and oak was already at work, calculating the cost of an assault in the imagination of the enemy. A smooth, flat door presents a simple problem. It invites attack, suggesting a quick victory might be possible, but a door bristling with hundreds of hardened iron studs presents a complex, exhausting puzzle. It whispers a series of unsettling questions into the attacker's thoughts. Do you have the right tools? Do you have enough time? Most importantly, do you have the sheer physical endurance to see this through? Every gleaming stud was a promise of blunted axes, of shattered crowbars, of hours spent in a futile, deafening struggle. The message was brutally clear. This is not a quick prize. This is a long, grueling, and painful ordeal. It transformed the idea of a simple break-in into the grim prospect of a miniature siege, a battle of attrition fought on the defender's terms. The door was not just built to withstand an attack, it was designed to prevent one altogether. by making the very thought of an assault seem foolish from the start. This reliance on iron was a distinctly European answer to a universal problem. Across the Mediterranean, the Romans approached door security with a different material and a different mindset. Their most important doors, guarding temples and imperial buildings, were often sheathed in bronze. This was not a grid of individual studs, but a continuous, hammered sheet of metal covering the entire wooden core. The effect was one of overwhelming, seamless power and wealth. Bronze was costly and difficult to work on such a scale, making these doors statements of imperial authority as much as functional barriers. They projected an image of invulnerability, but their defense was more about that monolithic, unbroken surface. Meanwhile, in the sophisticated carpentry traditions of Japan and China, master woodworkers achieved incredible strength without heavy metal armor. They developed complex interlocking joinery, fitting wooden beams and planks together with such precision that they became self-reinforcing structures. A Japanese gate might use massive, square posts and intricate bracketing, its security coming from the perfect balance and fit of its wooden components, designed to withstand earthquakes as well as attacks. These cultures solved the same problem of the vulnerable entrance, but their solutions reflected their unique resources, technologies, and artistic philosophies. The medieval European door stands apart for its pragmatic, almost patchwork genius. It did not require vast sheets of precious bronze or a lifetime of joinery mastery. It took a locally available, if difficult to work, material and applied it in the most efficient way possible. The studded door is a testament to a culture that prioritized modular, repairable, and fiercely practical defense, building its security one hammered iron disc at a time. That door was a living, breathing alarm. Beyond its physical strength, it possessed a voice, a terrible clangor that turned any attack into a public spectacle. Think of the sound an axe makes when it hits solid oak, a dull, heavy thud that might be muffled by the walls. Now imagine that same axe blade glancing off a wrought iron stud. The impact creates a sharp, high-pitched ring, a metallic shriek that carries for a remarkable distance. An attacker was not just fighting the door, he was fighting the noise it made. Every blow was a broadcast of his presence. Each strike of a hammer, each pry of a crowbar would produce a symphony of chaos, a cacophony of clangs and bangs that echoed through the quiet of a medieval night. Inside the building, the effect was immediate. The deep, resonant pounding on the thick wood would vibrate through the very floor, but the sharp, percussive ring of iron on iron was unmistakable. It was a sound that cut through sleep, through conversation, through the thickest stone walls. It was a sound that meant danger, a sound that triggered a well-rehearsed response. Guards would snap to attention, servants would rouse the household, the lord would reach for his sword. The door was not a passive barrier, it was an active sentry, screaming a warning with every blow it endured. This acoustic defense reached far beyond the walls of the building itself. In a quiet village or a secluded castle yard, that metallic clamor would travel, alerting neighbors, nearby guards in the watchtower, or soldiers stationed in the outer bailey. A attempted break-in was no longer a private affair between a thief and a lock. It became a community event. The door's voice summoned an entire network of defenders, turning a covert operation into a desperate and very loud battle against time. These ancient doors are not just ideas in a history book. They are physical objects that have endured for centuries, and we can still go and see them today. One of the most magnificent examples is the great door to the chapter house at Westminster Abbey in London. Crafted in the 13th century, it has stood for over 700 years. Its surface is a breathtaking tapestry of iron, with hundreds of studs arranged in dense, overlapping diamond patterns. The wood is dark with age, but the ironwork is as secure as the day it was hammered in. This door has witnessed plagues, fires, and coronations, yet its defensive grid remains unbroken, a silent guardian that has never failed its duty. Further south, the might of Dover Castle guards the English coast. Its inner bailey gate boasts a door that is the very definition of medieval fortification. The oak is incredibly thick and the iron studs are massive, placed in a powerful, no-nonsense grid. This door was the last line of defense for the castle's heart, and you can still see how its formidable presence would have discouraged any assault. Then there is Chepstow Castle in Wales, home to one of the oldest castle doors in all of Europe. This door dates to the late 12th century and it is a humbling sight. The wood has hardened to the consistency of stone, and its original iron straps and studs are still clenched tightly to the planks. For 800 years, this single piece of timber and iron has withstood the damp Welsh air, sieges, and the simple decay of time. What is their secret? It is the perfect synergy of materials. The oak, as it aged, did not become brittle. It hardened, becoming even more resistant to impact. The wrought iron, hand-forged and fibrous, possesses a natural flexibility that modern steel often lacks. It can absorb vibrations and shocks without cracking, moving ever so slightly with the wood as it expands and contracts with the seasons. These are not relics preserved in a climate-controlled case. They are veterans of the elements, their surfaces worn smooth by rain and wind, yet their structural integrity is absolute. They stand as permanent proof that this technology was not just a theory. It was a resounding, long-term success. To stand before them is to understand that the medieval mind did not build for a decade or even a century. They built for eternity. Hollywood would have you believe a knight's sword gets permanently stuck between those iron studs. This dramatic visual makes for a great movie scene, but it collapses under the weight of simple physics. A swinging blade does not embed itself in solid oak, only to be neatly trapped by a circle of iron. The reality of combat is far more brutal and chaotic. A sword is a slashing and thrusting weapon, not a chopping tool like an axe. Its sharp edge is designed to cut through flesh and light armor, not to bite deep into dense, vertical-grained oak. Even if a warrior made the foolish decision to hack at a door, the blade would most likely bounce off the hardened wood or skid across the rounded iron studs, leaving little more than a scratch. The studs were not weapon traps, they were deflection devices designed to rob any strike of its power and protect the integrity of the wood itself. Another persistent myth paints these doors as purely decorative, a stylistic choice to make a castle entrance look more imposing. This ignores the profound economic and practical realities of the Middle Ages. Iron was far too expensive and labor-intensive to be used frivolously. No lord would have paid a blacksmith to spend weeks forging hundreds of studs, then a carpenter to painstakingly install them, just for a pleasing pattern. Every piece of iron represented a significant investment, a direct translation of wealth into security. The decoration that emerged was a happy byproduct of necessity, not the primary goal. The beautiful cross or diamond pattern was first and foremost a functional grid, a network of reinforcement. Its visual appeal was secondary, a testament to the human instinct to create order and meaning, even in objects designed for war. To see them as mere decoration is to miss their true purpose as a hybrid of brute force engineering and symbolic communication. The true test of their design lies not in a filmmaker's imagination, but in the silent testimony of the doors that have survived for centuries. Look at the ancient oak of the Westminster Abbey door, its surface a complex mosaic of iron. You will not find sword gashes neatly lodged between the studs. Instead, you see the gentle wear of ages, the iron polished smooth by time and the elements. These surfaces tell a story of enduring strength, not of frantic, trapped blades. The historical reality is that if an enemy host reached your main gate, the last thing they would use is a sword. They would bring forward the tools of siegecraft, the heavy battering ram, the dedicated war axe, or even fire. The studded door was engineered specifically to counter these real and devastating threats. It was a practical solution born from a dangerous world, a masterpiece of defense whose true story is more fascinating than any fiction. The age of the iron-studded guardian could not last forever. Its decline began not with a whisper, but with the thunderous roar of a new kind of weapon. The invention of gunpowder and the rise of cannons fundamentally changed the rules of warfare. No door, no matter how thick its oak or how dense its iron grid, could withstand a direct hit from a cannonball. The very concept of defense shifted. A castle's strength was no longer measured by the height of its walls or the heft of its gates, but by its ability to withstand artillery barrages from a distance. Fortresses evolved into low, sprawling complexes of earthworks and angled bastions designed to deflect cannon fire. In this new world, the studded door was suddenly obsolete for military purposes. Its legendary strength was rendered meaningless against an enemy who could simply blast a new doorway through the stone wall beside it. The primary threat it was built to counter, the focused assault of men with hand tools, was no longer the greatest danger. The door's defensive role was downgraded from a primary shield to a secondary barrier, a psychological holdover in an age of gunpowder. This military revolution was matched by a quieter one in the world of architecture and daily life. As the constant fear of raids and sieges began to recede in many parts of Europe, the home started to transform. The dark, fortified manor house, designed primarily for defense, gave way to a new ideal, the comfortable, well-lit country house. The focus was no longer on keeping people out, but on letting light and air in. The massive, single-slab oak door was replaced by the elegant paneled door. This new design used a lightweight frame filled with thinner wooden panels, a construction that was cheaper, lighter, and far more versatile. It allowed for larger windows and a greater sense of openness, reflecting a society that was increasingly looking inward, toward domestic comfort and aesthetic beauty, rather than outward in constant vigilance. The very symbol of the home was changing from a fortress to a sanctuary. Security did not disappear, of course, it simply evolved, becoming more sophisticated and less visible. The heavy internal bolt and massive lock were gradually replaced by more complex and concealable mechanisms. The invention of the mortise lock in the 18th century allowed the locking mechanism to be housed entirely within the thickness of the door itself, hidden from view. This was a cleaner, more discreet form of security. Keys became smaller and more intricate, moving away from the large, heavy objects of the medieval period. At the same time, new civic structures like organized police forces and street lighting began to provide a layer of communal security that the individual household no longer had to shoulder alone. The responsibility for protection was slowly shifting from the private door to the public street. Why invest a fortune in a door that could stop a battering ram when the greatest threat was now a silent burglar with a set of lockpicks? The new security technologies were designed for that precise, covert battle, a world away from the deafening, brute force assaults of the past. The iron stud did not vanish overnight. It lingered in rural areas and on older buildings, a fading echo of a more perilous time, but its purpose had fundamentally changed. In many cases, the studs became purely decorative, a nostalgic nod to a bygone era of strength and permanence. You can still see this today on some modern doors or garden gates, where fake plastic or metal studs are applied to evoke a rustic, old-world charm, completely divorced from their original life or death function. The language of the studded door, once so urgent and clear, had been translated. Its message of raw, hammered power was softened into a whisper of historical style, a final, gentle reminder of the centuries when your front door was your strongest soldier. That powerful legacy of iron and oak is not locked away in museums alone. It lives on in the very words we speak every day. Consider the phrase, dead as a doornail. We use it to describe something utterly and permanently finished, but its roots are buried deep in the construction of those medieval doors. The doornail in question was not a simple nail. It was the heavy shank of an iron stud or a massive hinge pin. After it was driven through the thick oak, the blacksmith would hammer the hot, protruding end flat against the metal rove on the inside of the door. This process of clenching rendered the nail dead. It could not be pulled out, straightened, or reused for any other purpose. Its working life was permanently over, its function dedicated forever to that single, vital door. This was not a temporary fix, it was a final, unchangeable act of security, and the language captured that sense of absolute finality perfectly. These doors gave us another common expression: to get your foot in the door. Today it means gaining an initial opportunity, but its original meaning was far more literal and desperate. In a world of heavy, self-closing doors, the only way a persistent salesman or an unwelcome visitor could prevent you from shutting them out was to physically jam their foot into the narrowing gap. That single, stubborn foot was the difference between rejection and a chance to plead your case. The door itself became the arbiter of opportunity, a barrier that had to be overcome through sheer physical insistence. Even the simple word threshold has a history paved with meaning. It comes from the Old English word threshold, which relates to threshing, the act of beating grain to separate it from the chaff. The theory is that in very early homes, the doorway might have held a piece of wood to contain the straw and chaff that accumulated on the floor from the daily work of threshing. The threshold was literally the piece that held the thresh. Over time, as floors became more solid, the word evolved to mean the entrance itself, the symbolic point of separation between the ordered, domestic world inside and the untamed, shaft-strewn world outside. Every time we cross a threshold, we are unknowingly echoing an ancient agricultural past. These phrases are more than just quaint idioms. They are linguistic artifacts, tiny windows into a world where the door was the most important object in daily life, a symbol of finality, opportunity, and transition that was so powerful it became permanently embedded in our shared language. Centuries after their defensive purpose faded, these iron-studded doors found a surprising second life. The brutal practicality of the Middle Ages was reborn as romantic theater during the 19th century's Gothic revival. This was an era that looked back on the medieval period not with fear, but with a deep, nostalgic longing. To architects and thinkers like Augustus Pugin, the stark, honest forms of Gothic architecture represented a lost age of faith, craftsmanship, and social order, a spiritual antidote to the grimy, industrializing world. Pugin did not just copy old designs. He passionately believed that Gothic was the one true style for Christian buildings, and he championed its return with every fiber of his being. When he and others like him reintroduced the studded door, it was not because they feared battering rams. It was because they craved the powerful story the door told. The iron studs were no longer functional armor. They had become a symbol, a piece of visual shorthand for authenticity, history, and solemn grandeur. You can see this romantic revival everywhere once you know to look for it. Grand churches built in the 1800s feature massive, studded doors that evoke a sense of timeless sanctity. University libraries and lecture halls adopted the style to suggest a connection to ancient seats of learning and wisdom. Even the entrances to wealthy industrialist mansions were fitted with these doors, their studs proclaiming a lineage and stability that new money could not otherwise buy. The door's message had been completely reinvented. Its original language of fear and defense was translated into a new dialect of prestige and drama. The studs were now purely for show, a beautiful and evocative lie that spoke to a culture desperately trying to recapture a past it had only just begun to understand. That powerful image of the iron-studded door, forged in the fires of real medieval necessity, never truly vanished. It simply marched out of our history books and straight into our collective dreams. The archetype found a new, permanent home in the sprawling landscapes of fantasy. When you picture the entrance to a forgotten dwarven hall in Tolkien's Middle-earth, what do you see? A massive single slab of stone or ancient wood, often flanked by carved pillars, but always bound with bands of metal and rows of heavy studs. These are the doors of Moria of Erebor, gates that guard not just people, but entire kingdoms and their legendary treasures. Tolkien, a scholar of ancient languages and myths, understood the deep symbolism. He borrowed the real object and amplified its meaning for his epic tales. His doors are not just barriers, they are thresholds to adventure, sealed with magic and mystery, waiting for the right word or the right key to be spoken. This was not a random design choice, it was a direct inheritance from our own world's history, a visual shorthand that audiences instantly understand. The studded door in fantasy tells you everything you need to know before a single character speaks. It says that what lies behind is ancient, valuable, and perilous to obtain. It promises a challenge, a puzzle to be solved, or a force to be overcome. This is why the image resonated so powerfully and why it was eagerly adopted by the creators of Dungeons & Dragons. In a game built on exploration and discovery, the door is more than set dressing. It is an interactive encounter. The dungeon master describes a heavy oak door, banded with iron and studded with rusted rivets. Immediately, the players lean in. Their minds begin to race. Is it trapped? Is it locked? What forgotten horror or glorious reward is sealed away behind that familiar, formidable facade? The door becomes a character in the story, an obstacle that demands a decision. Do the warriors try to break it down, risking noise and exhaustion? Do the rogues search for hidden mechanisms or attempt to pick the lock? The studded door is the perfect catalyst for this kind of strategic drama. Its design suggests a history of conflict and security, inviting the players to become part of that continuing story. This archetype thrives because it taps into a universal human curiosity. We are drawn to closed doors, especially those that look like they have a secret to keep. A modern smooth door is functional. It tells us nothing, but an old studded door is a narrative. Its scars and rust hints at untold stories. It stands as a silent guardian of mysteries, and we are hardwired to want to uncover what it protects. This is the door to the Wizard's Tower, the sealed crypt of a lit king, the vault of a dragon's hoard. It is the last thing the hero sees before the world changes forever. The fantasy genre did not invent this powerful symbol. It simply recognized an ancient truth and gave it a new magical life, ensuring that the legacy of the iron-studded door would continue to guard our most precious treasures, not in stone castles, but in the endless realms of our imagination. Preserving these ancient doors is a battle against time itself, fought not with axes but with microscopes and delicate tools. Conservators approach each door as a unique patient, diagnosing centuries of wear, rot, and corrosion. Their primary rule is minimal intervention. They are not restorers aiming to make the door look new, but conservators dedicated to stabilizing its current state, halting decay while preserving every scratch, dent, and patina that tells its long story. The wood, often hardened to near petrification, is carefully cleaned and consolidated. Special resins are painstakingly injected into microscopic cracks to bind the ancient oak fibers together, strengthening it from within without altering its appearance. The iron presents its own complex challenge: active rust, which can flake and expand, slowly destroying the wood beneath it, must be carefully removed. But that stable, dark patina, the beautiful reddish-brown layer that forms over centuries, is deliberately left intact. This patina is the iron's own protective shield, a testament to its age, and removing it would erase a vital part of the door's history. Each stud and strap is meticulously documented, its corrosion treated with precise chemical solutions, and sometimes given a thin, protective wax coating to shield it from modern pollutants. This work is incredibly slow and deliberate, a partnership between modern science and ancient craft, ensuring that these silent guardians will continue to stand watch, telling their stories for centuries to come. That door was never just wood and iron. It was a perfect conversation between fear and ingenuity, a masterful blend of brute force engineering, psychological deterrence, and symbolic expression. We have traveled from the terror of an axe blow to the silent language of a cross-shaped pattern. We saw how the studs distributed crushing force, how they broke the weapons and the will of attackers, and how they proclaimed the wealth and faith of those who lived within. This was not a simple design. It was a holistic solution, a direct and brilliant response to the very real dangers of a world where your front entrance was your most critical point of failure. They transformed a simple, vulnerable door into a formidable, multi-layered barrier. The next time you find yourself near an old church, a castle, or even a historic manor house, pause for a moment. Look closely at the main door, see past the old wood and the dark metal, see the grid of studs not as decoration, but as the ghost of a long-vanished fear and the enduring echo of a brilliant, practical mind. Each one is a hammered answer to an ancient question of survival. We would love to hear what you discover. Have you encountered a door with a story? Share a picture or a memory of the most interesting historical door you have ever seen in the comments below.